Alrighty. Hello everyone. I just want to check that people can hear me. In case you're surprised, it won't be Sasha running today's mini live stream. It'll be me. I'm Tom. Hold on, let me pull up my camera. There we go. So the first thing I want to do, I realize we're getting started just a bit before 5 past the hour, but can I just check that I'm audible and that there's no echo, that everything's working properly? Just post in chat if you can hear me and see me and all that good stuff. Perfect. Cool. So we have a sort of 1 minute till we get started. Great. Excellent. I see the flood of messages coming in now. It's good to have you all with us. Just so everyone's clear, this will be recorded, so you'll be able to access it later if you want to go back. I've also posted the code, the link to the live code in the chat, and you're welcome to look at that. There's not much there at the moment, but by the end of today, there should be some stuff there. So this is the sort of CS Bowling live stream. Let me actually jump over to my web view. I'll jump up the top. Cool. Forgive me for not using the full screen presentation mode. I'm going to want to jump between tabs, so it makes more sense to do it this way. But let's get started. And the way that I want to get started is just to go over what my plan for today is. So the plan is that this is going to run for 1 hour. So if you've got Math 1081 at 4 p.m., don't worry, we should get you there in time. I might be able to stick around for a little bit and answer a few questions, but the bulk of what I'm planning to do will take an hour. But first of all, what I wanted to check is there anything in particular that you're looking, that you would like to get out of this session? If you've got questions, you can post them in the chat and I will try and respond to them. It's only me, so it might take a moment, but please do post your questions in chat. If there's anything in particular that you want out of this session, let me know. What I'm planning to do today is talk to you very briefly about how you can get help for the assignment, how do you get marks in the assignment, talk about some frequently asked questions, and then a little bit of advice about getting through some of the parts of the assignment. So we're going to look at, first of all, at diagramming, which is one really useful way of getting through, or of telling sort of where do you need to use if statements and are your if statements correct. And then we're also going to talk about some stuff with variables and while loops. So it'll hopefully be a little bit of sort of revision of what Sasha's covered, but also maybe a few things that are really close to the assignment so that they'll help you. Let's take a quick look through the questions here. Is week 3 content needed for the assignment? No, but I'll get to that again in the FAQs. I'll try and focus on a little bit of style stuff. Absolutely. And I'm happy to try. I'll go over some stuff that will be relevant to the strikes and spares stuff. Cool. So, how often do we need to comment code? I'll talk about that as well. Perfect. And yeah, perfect. Okay. This is all stuff that hopefully I'll be able to go through throughout this tutorial, throughout this live stream. But please let me know at the end if I haven't covered something that you're expecting me to cover, and I'll be very happy to go over it sort of at the end. Quickly, I just want to talk about how you can get help. Obviously, like step number 1 is going to be going to your labs. You can get help with this in your labs, so that's a useful place to go, but some of you may have already had your labs. So if you're in that position, there are 2 really great ways you can get help. One of them is to go into the forums. So we've got lots of help at the moment on the forums. If you're stuck, if you would like to ask questions, you can go onto the forums. The one note, which I think we've said in pretty much every lecture, is please make sure you don't post your code on the forums. You can ask questions on the forums, but you should not be making your code public on the forums, because if you do that, other people might be copying it. So please don't do that. The other way you can get help is at help sessions. There are a bunch of them on. I think I pulled up earlier the link to, let me pull up the link to the help sessions. Here is a list of all of the help sessions that are on this week. There are quite a few of them. So please, if you're needing help, go to a help session. There are also some fast passes left. We're going to look today whether we can add more fast passes to the help sessions. But even if you don't have a fast pass, you can still go to a help session and get some help. So those are the main 2 ways of getting help. Now what I want to do is I just want to talk briefly through like how the marking works for this assignment. And I'll sort of touch on some of the things that people were mentioning in the chat as well. There are 3 components to the marking for this assignment. Part 1 is the performance marking. This is basically just like, does your code work? Now, auto tests are a really good way to check whether or not your code is working, but we can't write auto tests that do something for every single test case you could possibly run into. So especially in future assignments, passing the auto tests might not be enough to guarantee you full marks, but it's certainly a really good indication. In this assignment, hopefully, if you pass all of the auto tests, that's a really good hint that you're going to get full marks. Obviously, I can't make guarantees because, you know, if you've made some really specific weird bug where it only happens on like frame number 7, we might not be checking that. But generally, you can expect that auto tests are a good indication of how well you're doing. And we can see here that basically if you've done everything from week 1 to 2, that's going to be 50%. And then if you've done some parts of week 3, that'll be more marks. And if you do the whole of week 3, then you get full marks for the performance. There's actually some good questions in the chat, which I'll go to quickly. Are you only allowed to go to one help session? It won't let me book a fast pass for more than one. You can go to as many help sessions as you like, but you can only have a fast pass to one help session at a time. So basically, feel free to go to other help sessions that you don't have a fast pass to. You just might not get seen as quickly. But while you're holding that fast pass, you can't have 2 fast passes. You can only have one. Hopefully that makes sense. And to Michael's question, if I need someone to look at my code, how can I get help? The best way to do that, either go to your lab or go to a help session. Those are the 2 main ways. On the forums, tutors have access to your code. So if you ask a question, we can try and help as best we can. But the help sessions and labs are going to be the best places where you can go to like get help with a tutor sitting next to you. So that's performance marking. And thank you very much for those questions from the chat. The next thing is style marking. Now, style marking, this is at the bottom of the assignment and it got released this week, but this is how we're going to mark your style. So it's really important, and we'll just go through sort of the list of things that you want. Some of these are really easy and like they're basically free marks. So things like the header comment. Just check that you have a header comment that has a name, a ZID, or an email, and a description of the program. If you've got those things, that's a free mark right there. Things like white space and indentation, line length as well, those are all things that, again, you can check with 1511 style. And so that's definitely going to be an easy way of if you'd like just to know, am I going to get marks for that? If 1511 style says you're all good, those are pretty much things that you're going to get full marks for. Obviously good to just have a double check, but those are mainly things that we can automatically check. Things like variable names, though, to the question about whether or not 1511 style guarantees you full style marks, 1511 style can't actually check whether or not your variable name is sensible. So I once had a student who submitted a variable name called uwu, not a very sensible variable name, but you know, it wouldn't fail 1511 style. So that's one of the things where you're going to want to check with 1511 style, but you're also going to want to make sure that your variable names are sensible. Constants, again, not something that 1511 style will tell you about, but if you see that there are numbers that you're using in your program that you haven't defined, you should make them into constants. And lastly, there are marks for not using illegal elements. Now, what this means is, if it wasn't taught to you during weeks 1, 2, and 3, you aren't able to use it in this assignment. We're trying to get you to solve problems using what you've seen. We know that there are other solutions. You'll learn about them throughout this course and you'll learn about them throughout your computing degree. But for this assignment, you can only use the things that are available to you from weeks 1, 2, and 3. So please make sure that you're not using things that you haven't learned in the course. There was a question in the chat earlier about using arrays. Now, technically, I believe we're going to start touching on arrays on Friday. This assignment was not designed to be used with arrays. Our sample solution doesn't use them. And so my strong recommendation to you would be to not touch arrays in this assignment. There will be plenty of time to use them in assignment number 1. So my suggestion would be don't touch arrays. With functions, you're allowed to use them if you'd like to. But again, we'd recommend you're not going to need them for the assignment. We've designed our sample solution, again, doesn't use functions. So don't feel like you need to use functions. Question in the chat. To check your style, run 1511 space style space the name of your file. And I'm sure that Sasha might be able to put that in the chat as well. Cool, that's style marking. Let's now talk about video marking. So basically video marking falls into 4 parts. The video is going to need to be a less than 2-minute long video just explaining some points of style within your code. We're doing this to try and get you to reflect on your style, to try and make sure that you've understood what we're talking about with style, and so that you have a chance to sort of show us your code more than just checking the performance of the code. Now, There are, apart from checking that you do in fact follow the instructions and have a video that's a maximum of 2 minutes long, there are 3 categories of marks. The first one is that you should point out 3 distinct elements of style that you've used. So it might be something like your variable names or your choice of how you've used indentation. Maybe you can look back at the style marking guide to talk about different things on this list. But you're going to want to point out 3 different stylistic choices, and they should be like independent. So they shouldn't all just be the exact same. You know, I've chosen this name, I've chosen this name, and I've chosen this name. In terms of pointing out code, you should then, with each of those points of style, point at a particular place inside your code. So, you know, maybe line 13, if you've got a line 13, point at that and say, this is an example of that stylistic choice that I've made. And the last thing we want you to do is briefly identify something that you've learned from this assignment. And so you just need to say, basically, hello, here is a 1 point of style that I've learned, and here is an example in the code. Here's another point of style, here's an example in the code, a third point of style, a third example, and then just do a quick self-reflection at the end on one thing you've learned from the assignment. That's all that you're going to need to do. Cool. So that's video marking. I'm sure we can make these slides accessible afterwards. I'm sorry I didn't put them up in time because I don't normally do the lectures, but we can make these slides available afterwards. In terms of doing the screen recording, oh yeah, Sasha's answered it, perfect. Yes, you're welcome to screen record and do a voiceover, that's totally fine. Okay, some quick frequently asked questions. I think I've already answered most of them. Do I need to use functions? No, you don't. Are you allowed to use them? Yes, you are. Do you need to have good style? Yes. Take a look at the style marking rubric. Can I use things that Sasha hasn't taught yet? No, there is a penalty for doing so. Why do my previous auto tests stop working? This is a question we've gotten a few times, so 1 moment. Sorry. Why do my previous auto tests stop working? So you may have noticed that if you've done, say, part 3 of the assignment, you'll try and run your code again in part 4, and the part 4 has different requirements to part 3, and so code that passes the part 4 auto tests doesn't pass the part 3 auto tests. That's intentional. That's the way we've designed it, because the auto tests are basically to check that you've gotten up to where we wanted you to get to. Cool. Sorry, unfortunately my voice is getting a bit sore. Other question, do I need to pass 1511 style? Yes, you should pass 1511 style, but you don't absolutely need to, but that's not everything you need to do, sorry. Passing 1511 style doesn't guarantee you 4 marks. It just shows you things you could improve. Do current auto tests cover older auto tests? Basically, if you've passed a newer set of auto tests, that implies that you've already got the functionality of the older ones, hopefully. The most important auto test to pass is the last one, just as you're submitting, because that's like the final thing that we'll be checking against. Okay, let me just check if there's any good questions in chat. To ultimate secret. So code is like the actual place in code where you've used it, but the concept of style that you've used behind that, those are the 2 separate things we want you to look at. Okay, cool. Let's talk about diagramming now. So that's all the questions that I wanted to make sure people had answers to in terms of their code. But one way in which you can actually break things down and end up with a better piece of code is to, before you actually go out and start writing your code, or at least before you make changes to it, try and understand how the logic works. So here I've drawn a pretty simple diagram, well, somewhat simple, that shows you how the flow of bowling is supposed to work. It's not completely inclusive, but it's sort of a good start. And what we can see here is that it involves, you're going to scan in your first bowl, and there are 3 possibilities. Possibility 1 is that it's an invalid bowl, in which case you're going to print out invalid and do some more stuff and then go straight to scanning the second bowl. Possibility number 2 is it's valid, but it's not equal to 10, so it's not a strike. And possibility number 3 is that it is a strike. And then you can see it sort of flows on down from there. And so the reason that I'm showing you this is because what you're going to want to do is have a think about how you draw this diagram and then compare it to your code. And so a lot of people have been having a few issues with their if statements being out of order, or where they're saying, why does this thing happen and then this thing happens after it when they shouldn't happen in that order? If you've got a diagram like this, you may be able to sort of convert it into if statements and have a reference for like, why is this diagram different to what my if statements do? And you can sort of follow the paths through the diagram, follow the code, and see why they don't work out the same way. Cool. So that's a point about diagramming. Any questions about that? Now let me just check if there's anything else in here. Okay. Alrighty, so I think that I've done, I think I've answered most of the questions, and if we haven't got any other questions there, just to emphasize Bidu's point, yes, you can attend a help session without a FastPass. You don't need a FastPass. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to do, and this is probably going to take up most of the rest of today, is to go through some examples that I'm hoping will be very similar to the assignments that you're already working on. So they're not quite the same thing, you can't just copy paste them, but they should give you some hints that might be useful towards what we're doing in the assignments. So basically the game that we're going to be working on here, rather than being a bowling game, is just a flipping coins game. So many of you will know coins have two sides, either heads or tails, and so when you flip a coin, you randomly get one of heads or tails. And so the first thing that I want to do is I want to write a program that's going to scan in from the user whether they got a heads or a tails, and it's going to count the number of heads. That's the first thing we're going to do, and you're going to notice that that's quite similar to parts 1 and 2 of this week. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to check if we get 2 heads in a row. And my hope is that the way that we're going to do this will be quite similar to how you do parts 3 and 4 of the assignment. So let's jump into some code. Let me swap what I'm showing you. Ooh, I'm on the other side now. That's very fun. So let me pull up here. So as I said before, there is a link to look at the code here. I've put it in the chat at the start, and I might put it in there again if I can. There we go. So in the chat, you'll be able to find a link to the code that I'm working on. But let's do the usual stuff. So get it, we're going to open up coinflipping.c, ampersand at the end. Here's the code that I've already written. So I've got a nice header comment, and then I've got this coin count variable here. So this is going to count how many coins we've scanned. Let's say we're going to scan in 10 coins. We've got this char coin, which is where we're going to scan into. So we're going to scan H for heads and T for tails. And then in here, we're going to actually count how many heads we've got. So there's a few things that aren't quite right with this code as it stands. The first thing is that you may remember that when we're using a while loop, we actually need to do 3 things. We've got to have our counter, which is here. We've got to have our condition, but we also need to increment it. So let's just put that in quickly before we do anything else. Coin count equals coin count plus 1. And you may have remembered from yesterday that you could also do plus equals 1. So that's just a shorter way of saying coin count equals coin count plus 1. And the other thing we're going to do is we're going to scan in whether it was heads or tails. Great point from the comments, and I'm glad somebody brought this up. I was going to leave this till later, but it's really good that you've noticed. So this 10 here, this is a constant. So we should probably hash define num flips. So how many flips do I get to do? To 10. And somebody else has pointed out another thing, which was definitely an intentional mistake that I totally didn't forget to do. I need to hash include stdio.h. And that's going to make sure I can print stuff out. Cool. So I've got my constant here. I'm going to use it. And so now I can say, well, coin count is less than num flips. And some of you might be thinking here, this looks a little bit like my code, and hopefully you are, because this is very similar to scanning in 10 frames worth of numbers. So I've got my coin counter. I'm going to do this while loop 10 times. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to scanf into %c, ampersand coin. So this is scanning in a character. In this case, it's going to be hopefully either H or T for heads and tails, and I'm scanning that into coin. Now, one thing we might want to do is check that the user has actually given us heads or tails. So let's do that. If coin not equal to heads and coin not equal to tails, we've got a few different options for what we could do here. But what I might do is I might say that by default, we set the coin flip to be tails. And the reason that I'm doing it this way is so that we have to type in H if it's a heads. But you could choose how to do this error handling, and I might even put in a printf here to say, wait, that's not heads or tails. If I wanted to make a pun, I could even say, I can't make heads nor tails of it. But I should have thought of that earlier. But here we go. I've checked, is my coin heads or tails? And so if it's not heads and it's not tails, then we're going to say it's not heads or tails. Okay, so this, you might notice, is quite similar to some of the error handling that we had to do in week 2. It's not quite the same, but sort of similar. And now, can everyone tell me in chat, how am I going to check whether we've got a heads? And maybe give me some hints about what should I do to keep track of how many heads I've seen. So there's two parts to that question. What do I need to do here to check whether I've got a heads? And how can I keep track of how many heads I've seen? I'll give people a second to think about it. And Ashley's got a great question there. Why did I make 10 a constant? So the reason why is exactly as you've said. It's because it's easier for other people to understand. And it's even easier for you to understand. You know that 10 isn't some random number. 10 is the number of flips we get to do. The other handy thing as well is that if I decided later, say, I only want to have 8 flips rather than 10, it's easier to change this. Whereas if I put 10 everywhere throughout the code, I'd have to go through and change it. Oh, great question. Why does it say coin equals T here? So this is to indicate that by default, actually I'll put this on the line above. By default, if we don't know what the flip is, let's make it a tails. So this is just error handling. It's just me saying by default we're going to make this tails. And you might notice that there's actually something similar that we do in our assignment where we've got to deal with invalid inputs. So here I'm just saying it's equal to tails. In fact, even here's a better point. Somebody's saying, what does this line mean? Coin equals T. Why don't, instead of me saying H and T, why don't I say heads is H and tails is T? Now, even nicer, I can say, oh, is coin not equal to heads and coin not equals to tails, then coin equals tails. But all we're doing here is we're just setting a constant. Let me come back to that question I was asking earlier. How can I keep track of how many heads I've seen? There's a great point there. What if I created some sum variable and modified that? So I kept track of how many heads there were by using some variable. The suggestion there was to call it sum. It might be even nicer to call it coin count. Or, excuse me, to call it heads count. And so this is the count of how many heads have I seen. And so yeah, as Jeffrey's saying, you need to have a variable that records num of heads. So here's my heads count. Okay, but how do I know when I need to add to that variable? Ah, perfect, somebody's suggested it there. So what was suggested there was that I should say heads count equals heads count plus coin count. That's one idea. I'm not quite sure that that's going to get us where we're going to go, but it's a good start. So somebody else has said maybe we need to use a sort of plus plus or adding 1 to it. So rather than coin count, we'll say head count equals head count plus 1. But unfortunately, this isn't quite going to do what we want, even this, because here, every time, no matter what type of coin we've seen, whether it's heads or tails, we add 1 to heads count. And so Jeffrey's suggestion was, what if we put it inside of an if statement? So if I say if coin equals heads, well then I add to heads count. Yeah. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, well, if the coin that we got was heads, add 1 to my count of heads. And the question there is, why is coin count plus equals 1? We only want to scan in 10 coins. So every time we go through this while loop, we're going to add 1 to coin count. So we start off with coin count equals 0, keep going, 1, 2, 3, 4, and eventually it'll be equal to num flips, and that's when we stop scanning in coins. So just like in the assignment where we only need to scan in 10 frames, here we're scanning in 10 coin flips. Lillian has a question, how do we do this with negative numbers and numbers over 10? Great question. It's going to look very similar to this, because there are 2 things that you've asked that you want to check. You want to check, is this a negative number, and is this over 10? Or another way of putting it is this greater than 0 and less than 10, maybe? So have a think about how you can phrase that question of, is this a negative number or a number over 10, into an if statement like this. Won't look quite the same, but it'll be similar. Oh, Michael's question is, what is this doing? Great question. This is the same thing as me saying coin count equals coin count plus 1. And so I could even say here as well, I could change this to be plus equals 1. Awesome. And there's a few good suggestions in the chat about maybe things that you might want to use, so and statements, the double pipe statement, and or. Okay. Cool. So here's our code now. It's going to scan in 10 heads or tails. By default, it's going to tell us if we didn't scan in heads or tails, wait, that's not heads or tails. And it'll also default to scanning in a tail. And then if it's heads, but only if it's heads, we add 1 to our heads count. At the end, what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out, we saw %d heads out of %d coins. And I can say heads count, coin count. And so here we go. We're going to print out, we saw some number of heads out of some number of coins. If there are any questions in the code, questions about the code, chuck them in the chat now. Let's try and compile it and see how it goes. You can ignore these warnings, they won't really happen. No, they don't matter, sorry. I'm going to clear my screen. And let me now do dcc-o coin flipping, coinflipping.c. So it compiled okay. We didn't have any errors. Now I can run coin flipping. So one thing we didn't do that we probably should have done is have a prompt. So here we're just scanning in H to T. H, T, H, T, H, T, H, T, H, T. So you can count here. I've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 heads. So we should have 5 heads and 10 coins. Let's see what we say. It says we saw 5 heads out of 10 coins. Okay. Go back into the code quickly, and maybe what I'll do is I will add a new line here. And I'm also going to add a prompt. So many of you will have done this in week 2, or possibly even week 1. I'm going to print out what coin side came up, question mark. And so now if I rerun my code again, it's the exact same code that we had before. Just a little bit nicer to use. Heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails. There we go. It tells us 5 heads out of 10 coins. Cool. Okay. I saw one really good question in there. In this case, I've used 2 if statements. Would it still be correct to have the first one as an if statement and the second one as an else if statement, or would that be incorrect? That is a really excellent question. And one of the main things actually that people are going to have to deal with during this assignment, and where diagramming can be really helpful, is what needs to be an if statement, what's an else if statement, what's an if inside of an if. So in this case, since we know that the coin isn't heads and isn't tails, and we know that the coin is going to end up being a tails coin, it's totally fine to have this be separate ifs. It's also fine to have this be an else if. But if I change the question slightly, and I said, well now, by default, if we type in something random, we'll call it a heads. So if any letter apart from tails meant a heads, then it would be different behavior whether or not we had else if here or just if. So it really depends on what the question is that you're asking. In this case, I'll leave it as is, and so it really doesn't matter whether we use an if or an else if, but if you change the question slightly, then if and else if can depend. There's some really good chat in the chat right now about comments. I'll let Sasha keep on answering those. Cool. Alrighty. So, any other questions about this code? Just to review what we've done, we kept track of how many coins we've scanned in. We wanted to scan in 10 eventually. We've kept track of how many heads we've scanned in. And we've made this coin here, which is what we scanned the coin being heads or tails into. We have a while loop, and this while loop is going to increment coin count 10 times. And we're going to print out some prompt and then scan in a character. If the character isn't equal to heads or tails, so if it's some other letter, then we print out, wait, that's not heads or tails, and we default to using coin equals tails. And then, if the coin is heads, we add 1 to our heads count, which means we've noticed that there was 1 more heads than there was before. And then regardless of whether it was heads or tails, we always increment coin count by 1, so we're always going to scan in 10 coins. In the end, we print out, we saw however many heads out of how many coins. Let's just test this a little bit more, because remember, it's good to do your own testing. It's good to just check that things work. Can anyone make a suggestion for some cases that I might want to test? Post in chat. There's a few good questions in chat actually to Ed and Benj. The end of the if statement has to come right before the start of the else if statement. If you put something in between, then C doesn't actually know whether where the else if is supposed to be in relation to. So the if and the else if have to be right next to each other. You can't put other stuff in between. And when I say 2 ifs, what I mean by that is just an if statement and then another if statement directly below it. But what you could have is nested if statements even, where you had one if statement, and then inside that if statement you have another if statement. That would be a different case to what I was talking about, but that's also possible. I'll go back to my question. Any suggestions for test cases, things that I might want to try with this calculator? Andy's got a really good question. By having coin count equals 0, doesn't that make my first coin a 0 flip instead of a first slip? I guess so, but it doesn't really matter because the user isn't seeing that number. In your assignment, you might want to start with coin flip being equal to 1, because you've got to print out which coin flip it is. But I didn't want to show that here. It doesn't really make a difference as long as we always do it 10 times. Haven't been any suggestions yet for what I should do here. One thing I might want to try is all tails. Cool, and we saw 0 heads out of 10 coins. That makes sense. I might try all heads as well. Cool, that also worked. 10 heads out of 10 coins. And I might also want to try typing in some values that aren't heads or tails. heads. Cool. And so even though I've scanned in a bunch of random letters, it gave me an error. It said that's not a heads or tails. And then it told me I've only typed in 2 heads. Yeah, Charles, great point. That's exactly what we're doing. Nice work. Okay, so that was us looking at how we do, it's very similar to the first 2 parts of week 3. So you'll note that having this while loop here and having this count of heads is very similar to what you're going to be doing in the assignment. But now let's talk about part 3 and 4 of week 3. And so for those of you who don't remember, this is detecting whether something was a strike or a spare, and acting based on that information. So to give you a good example, what we're going to do here is we're going to look whether or not we've had 2 flips of this, 2 flips of heads in a row. So if you have heads, tails, that's fine. But if you say heads, tails, heads, heads, then after that second heads, we're going to print out a little message saying, hey, you just had a heads. That's what we're going to try and do here. So, any suggestions for how I might keep track of whether the last coin that I scanned in was also a heads? What could I do? Give people a second to think about it. How could I keep track of whether what I had was heads? Of the last thing that I had was heads or not? I'll give you a hint. It's kind of similar to how we kept track of the sum of, I guess that was called sum before, but the heads count, how many heads we've seen. What I might want to do is I might want to create a variable called was last coin heads. Now, this is a Boolean, it's either true or false. So what we could even do is we could have hash define true and hash define false. And this lets us talk about whether something is true, it's a true statement, whether it's a false statement. So in this case, because we haven't had any coins before, we're going to start this off as being false. Was the last coin heads? No, it wasn't. And yeah, a lot of people have put great suggestions in the chat. Using a flag, set something to 0 and add 1 if there's a head. Exactly right. All these are great suggestions. So I've got my was the last coin heads variable. Now, there are 2 parts to this. Part 1 is setting that flag, and part 2 is using the flag. So let's magically assume for the moment that we already know whether our last coin was heads or tails. So hopefully what we already know is, I'll put this if statement in here. Okay. If the last coin was heads, and this coin is also a heads, then print out a message. Okay? So that's what we want to stay in our if statement. If the last coin was a heads, and also this coin is a heads, then print out a message. And so if I magically have a variable called was last coin heads, then this is a really easy if statement to write. I write was last coin heads and coin equals heads. That's what this if statement is doing. We've got this magical was last coin heads variable, and then we check whether this coin is also equal to heads. If this happens, that's great. We can print out a message, 2 heads in a row, very lucky. I'll put a new line there. So, just to go over that one more time, we created a variable called was last coin heads. For the moment, it's always false. But if we magically pretend that this variable is working, then we can use was last coin heads and coin equals heads. This is actually something we do occasionally in programming. We'll write ourselves maybe a function or write ourselves a variable and we say We haven't quite calculated what the value is yet, but I'm going to use it here. And now all we need to do is we just need to make sure that this was last coin heads variable works. Now, how are we going to do that, you might ask? Well, and there's a great point there. Why don't I say last coin heads equals true? I am going to do that. As it turns out, you don't need to do that, because was last coin heads by itself is also a fine if statement. But just not to confuse anyone, I'm going to say last coin heads equals true. This just means making sure was last coin heads equal to true. Now, and the question about style, is it good style to use comments before all your if statements? Hopefully, your if statements are readable enough that you don't need comments. So if I didn't have this here, and you just read off, was last coin heads equal true, and coin equals heads, you could read that and say, with the last coin heads and is coin heads. And if you just read that out, that kind of makes sense. But just to make sure that everyone is on the same page, I've got this comment here as well. The other thing which can be nice is before you've written it, to write out a description of what you're doing, and then to use that if statement. Make sure that it makes sense in context. So I've got my comments for what I wanted to do. I check my if statement makes sense. And then once I'm done, I might delete the comment because the if statement is good enough. Cool. So I've got this magical variable here, was last coin heads. It's a flag variable, you might have heard it called. And the only problem is it's not actually equal to anything yet, or at least it's always equal to false. How can I check whether or not last coin was heads? I'll give that as a question to people. How am I going to do this? How am I going to use this variable? How am I going to set this variable? Any thoughts? I'll give people a second. We always have a bit of a wait here. What we really want to do is we want to remember what this was from the last time we used our went through our while loop. So this is going to be a bit weird, but we're going to write it out first, and then I'll show you kind of a nice way of thinking about it. If the coin, so Anthony said here, if in the if statement at the bottom, change the variable state. So here was last coin heads equals true. So this is a bit weird because I don't know what the last coin was, but the current coin is true. The current coin was a heads. And so when you look at this at first glance, you're saying, well, this isn't talking about the last coin, but immediately after the if statement, what's going to happen? We're going to go back around coin count plus equals 1 and scan in a new coin. And when we scan in that new coin, now last coin was heads makes total sense because it's storing the previous coin and whether or not that was heads. And so here we've scanned in a coin. We're checking if this coin is heads or tails. And now, was last coin heads? That's correct. It's going to tell me if the last thing was heads, it'll be true. If the last thing wasn't heads, it'll be false. Now there's one last problem with this setup. Can anyone point me at what might be wrong here? We do a great job. We set last coin heads to be true, but we're missing something. Anyone point it out? What might be the issue? Cool. So what if it's not true? We set it to true here, but what happens if we don't, what happens if we have another tails after this point? Let me show you an example. Let's compile this code again. So if I run tails, 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 heads, heads, Perfect. Worked completely well. Tails, tails. If I type in this heads here, I should expect it's not going to print anything out because it's the first tails, sorry, it's the first heads in a row. But we still get this 2 heads in a row message, even though we haven't had 2 heads in a row. And as a few people have suggested, if it's not true, then the if statement is not correct. So we actually need to set this variable back to being false again. Now, what you could do is you could say, well, if the coin is tails, then set was last coin heads to false. But what might be an easier way of doing it is in here, once we've used the fact that was last coin heads is true, we can set it back to false again. And so we've used this magical variable that tells us whether the previous thing was true or false, and now we're getting rid of that value. And so what's going to happen here is, well, if the last coin was a heads, that's great, we'll print this message out, and then we set it back to being false, and then we check again down here, was the last coin heads or not? You could also, might make more sense to some of you, to just always set was last coin heads to false here. That's so smart. It's a fun little trick. So all we're doing here is we're setting this with the correct value at the end of the while loop, using it at the start of the next while loop, and then resetting it here. Let me show you this at work. Tails, cool. Let's try it again. So tails, tails, heads, heads. We got that message, that's perfect. Tails, heads. Oh, sorry. Looks like I forgot to compile. Try that again. Tails, tails, heads, heads. That worked. Tails, heads. Nothing came up. Tails, heads, heads. 2 heads in a row. That worked again. Tails. Okay. Perfect. So, in this way, we get told whenever we've had 2 heads come up in a row, but we don't have to worry about that problem of every time after we've typed in 2 heads, we always get that message, because every time afterwards, we reset it back to false. Now, there's a question in the chat, do I need to have this was last coin heads inside or outside these brackets? It doesn't actually matter. Some of you might find it conceptually easier to think about it as being, once I've used this value, I reset it. And some of you might find it easier to say, we always set it to false, and then we set it back to true down here again. Can I explain this code again? I can. What I might do though, is I'm just going to show you one other way of thinking about this, because I realize that it's a bit sort of weird to think about in this way. Now, when you learned while loops, I'm just going to make a new file for this actually. So this file won't appear in the code yet, but I'll make sure that it appears at the end of the lecture. When you use a while loop, it's almost like you're copying and pasting the code multiple times. So this is really bad practice. We don't want to do this in our real code. But if I wanted to simulate what my while loop was doing, I could have the inner contents of my while loop 10 times. And so forth and so forth. I don't need to have it all 10 times. Let me just quickly save this as coin flipping no while loop .c. So here is the exact same code 10 times. It's pretty much the same thing as what our while loop was. It's just that it's not going to be able to like we've repeated the code lots of times. To be clear, this is really bad style. It's also really painful to manage. I don't want to actually have to deal with 10 of the same piece of code. So you shouldn't do this. But this is what the compiler's doing. DCC is taking your code, and it's actually going to pretend almost like you've written out the same piece of code 10 times. Now, this is why this is so useful. Now, I'm not thinking about my code jumping back up to the top of the while loop again. What I'm thinking about is my code is just going down from top to bottom. So let me explain the same piece of code, the exact same code that I've got here, but I'm just going to show it to you without the while loop. So we set our coin count equals 0, we set head count equals 0, was last coin heads equals false, and we set up this coin variable. Now, which side came up? We scan in a coin. And so this is us scanning in either heads or tails. If the coin is neither heads nor tails, then we print out, hey, that's not heads or tails, and we set it to false. Sorry, excuse me, we set it to tails. Sorry, set it to tails. Now, we do this check of if the last coin was heads and this coin is also a heads, and then print out a message. And if both this and the last coin were heads, we print out this message here. 2 heads in a row, very lucky. Now, this is the first time we're going through this, this code, so we haven't ever actually set was last coin heads to be equal to true, which means this this if statement is never going to happen. And then we set was last coin heads to false, and then if this coin was heads, heads count plus equals 1, and was last coin heads equals true. Now, let's walk through this with an example. I'm going to go back up to the top again, and we're going to walk through it with an example and see what happens. Let's say that here, I scan in tails. Well, this if statement isn't going to matter because coin is equal to tails. Here, last coin was heads, that's not true, but also the coin we have right now isn't heads. So that's also not true, so this is never going to happen. We set was last coin heads to false, so it's now false. And this is also not true, because remember we scanned in the tails. So coin equals tails, not heads, so we can ignore this. So none of these if statements get executed. That doesn't happen, this doesn't happen, and this doesn't happen either. So I'm just going to delete some of this code so it's clearer what's happened. Cool. So now we add 1 to our coin count, and to the computer, we've just jumped back to the start of the while loop again. So over here, we've gone from the bottom of the while loop back up to the top of the while loop. In our code here, though, we can see it's just sort of going straight down the list. So we ask again, what coin side came up? This time, let's type in a heads. Now, again, this if statement doesn't really happen, doesn't matter, because remember we've scanned in the heads here. And then we've got this was last coin heads was last coin heads equals true. That's still not true, because remember we set was last coin heads to false up here. Okay, but the coin is heads, even though one of these things is true, because it's an and statement, we still don't execute this piece of code. This doesn't happen. And once again, we set was last coin heads to false. But this time something's different. Because we scanned in H to coin here, coin equals heads. And so heads count goes up by 1. And was last coin heads also goes to true. So now let's keep this in mind. Was last coin heads is true. Just keep that one in your head. And then once again, we sort of go down to the bottom of the while loop. This is the end of the while loop here. Coin count plus equals 1 again. And just like before, we're at the bottom of our while loop. Here we are. And once again, C is going to take us back up to the top of the while loop. And so when we're looking at it in this perspective, it's kind of unclear what's happening because you've jumped around in your code a little bit. But over here, we're just running the same piece of code again. We print out what coin side came up. We scan in a particular coin. Let's say it's heads again. We check was the coin heads or tails. Given that it was heads, we can get rid of this. Doesn't happen. And now here's where the magic happens. This is what's kind of hard to see if you're in the while loop version of it, but it's somewhat easier to see if you're in the sort of all put together non-while loop version. Was last coin heads equals true? Well, if we go back up here, we can see that we did set it to true because the last coin was heads, just before the end of the while loop. Let's put a comment here, that to the top of the while loop. So it's clear. So now we're back at the top of the while loop, but because last time we went through the while loop, we set was last coin heads, we're going to remember the fact that it was that last coin was heads. And since we scanned in H as coin here, coin equals heads. And so when we print out, we've actually had 2 heads in a row. And now we set was last coin heads to be equal to false again. And so as far as we're concerned now, was last coin heads equals false. And then we could keep going. So I might stop here for now, but you could keep walking through this example. And you could keep saying, okay, so now was last coin heads equals true again. And maybe if I typed in a tails next, it would set was last coin heads to false. You can keep sort of walking through the code. But in summary, what's actually happened inside of our code is that even though if you walked through it in the while loop, it's not really clear why this bit happens after this bit almost. If you walk through it just thinking about the code copied out 10 times, if you follow the code down, you can see that here we set was last coin heads to true. We walk down to the bottom of the while loop, we walk back up to the top of the while loop, and last coin heads is still true, which means that this if statement is true. Cool. So that's where I want to end this example. I'm going to note that this is almost the exact same idea that you're going to want to use for is spare and is strike. Because in both of those as well, you want to remember whether the last time going through the while loop, you had a strike or a spare. Just like here, we want to remember whether the last coin was heads. In our assignment, what we want to do is remember whether the last coin was whether the last 2 rolls were a spare or whether the last roll was a strike. This code here, coinflipping.c, is currently available. This code here will be available after the lecture. Okay, cool. So, one sec. Awesome. So that's pretty much the end of what I wanted to walk through. It's 4 o'clock now. So if there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them in the chat. Otherwise, feel free to go off to the other course that you're doing. But any questions, please put them in the chat. Cool. And yes, this will be recorded for later, don't worry. So it should be released right after. Yeah, perfect. Cool. Any other questions? Thanks so much. I'm glad to hear this was helpful. The other thing which I'll note is that you can absolutely put this on, you can look at the lab exercise. So it was the lab exercise called Dice Game. This will help you with Dice Game, and if you've gotten Dice Game already, that will help you with the assignment as well. Oops, sorry. Yeah, please post on the forum if you've got any other questions. Thank you very much, everyone.